If you can understand this one technique that has been used by some of the greatest warriors in history, then you can learn to rewire your brain much faster. And you will start counting your streaks in years instead of days. But if you don't, your streaks may even become shorter and you never even figure out why. Because maybe you've already reached 90 days once or twice or even more times. Or maybe you haven't yet. In any case, you will find out why this journey that you're going on is not about reaching 90 days, but something that most guys are not even aware of. The thing is, it's not really that important on what day you are. What is important is how you train your mind. And the more you train it, the faster you see results. So first, we go into the technique itself that warriors of the past have used. And then we go into how you can train it and actively rewire your brain much faster than you thought possible. Alright, a famous warrior who is a great example of this technique is Miyamoto Musashi. He lived around 1600 in Japan as a ronin, which is basically a samurai without a master that he serves. Miyamoto Musashi is still known today because of his writings and because he was a legendary fighter who has 60 confirmed duels. And he won every single one of them. And his book of the 5 rings is still being read today. So all in all, he sounds like a really skilled fighter. But you'd be surprised that some historians say that he was average at best when it comes to the sword. And they say that because he mostly only agreed to duels when he was capable of studying his opponent in depth beforehand. He studied their moves, their weapons, and even their attitudes. For example, Musashi fought Kojiro, who was considered the best fighter in Japan at the time. And he was like the perfect example of a samurai, doing everything by the book. And Musashi knew this. So what did he do? He showed up 2 hours late to the duel, and not even dressing for the occasion, knowing that this show of disrespect would make Kojiro angry. And if you're angry, you're less focused. Also, Musashi knew that Kojiro had a sword that was slightly longer than average. So Musashi made himself a sword that was even longer than Kojiro's. And Musashi won. So whether or not he was an average fighter, he certainly was a smart fighter, rarely rushing into a fight unprepared. And today's MMA fighters study hours of video material of their opponents before a fight. It's just the smart thing to do. And studying your opponent doesn't look glorious, but it is what makes those glorious moments happen. It gives you these moments that we're all craving deep down. Okay, you probably have a good idea of how a fighter studies his opponent in real life. But how do you do that in the internal world of your own mind? What do you study and how do you train it? Well, like most guys in the NOFAP community, you may consider the urge to be one of your greatest enemies. But even though you may have thought about urges a lot, why you have them, how to overcome them, how to avoid them, can you answer this simple question? What is an urge? I've asked that question to a lot of guys over the years, and the most common response I get is a lot of and maybe your idea of an urge is a little bit vague as well, but that's okay. A good start is something along the lines of an itch that you just can't scratch, which honestly is one of the worst feelings. But you can go much deeper than that. And if you want to win over any urge for the rest of your life, then you have to study urges the same way Musashi studied his opponents. Because the more familiar you get with urges, the more you will experience 4 powerful changes. First, they will become weaker immediately, and we will go into how that happens in a moment. Next, you will start seeing them coming from a mile away, meaning you will be able to catch them when they're still very weak and a lot easier to deal with. Also, you will gain much more clarity on the underlying pains that create the urge, because 9 times out of 10 you will discover a completely different pain going on underneath, but we are just aware of the raging urge on top. And the clearer the underlying pain is to you, the better you can address it, which would then ease the pain and make it vanish. There are very complex things that can be going on here, like trauma or CPTSD. And there are things you can do to heal that, but we have to go into that in other videos. And number 4, sometimes it's not even necessary for you to do anything about the underlying pain. And literally by just being fully aware of the urge, your nervous system starts calming down again, and the urge dissolves right then and there. Alright, now let's go into why the urge becomes weaker sometimes, just by observing it. And the thing is, that doesn't only apply to urges. This also happens with all kinds of negative emotions, like fear, for example. A story that I once heard explains really well how that works. It was about two guys who traveled the wilderness somewhere in the US when there was still the Wild West. And I don't really remember how they got into this situation, but they really were not prepared for it. They were in a desperate situation and far away from any safety or civilization. And to their horror, they heard wolves howling. And they seemed to follow them. And they could constantly hear the wolves howling over there, over here, all the time. They seemed to be surrounded basically. But they could never see the wolves. They only heard the sounds and the howling all around them. And that went on for days. They couldn't sleep anymore. And their fear and their mental state became worse with every passing day. What started out as worry grew into fear, which grew into dread, which grew into desperation, and then panic. They felt hopeless, helpless, and completely overwhelmed by the situation. So much so that their imagination started running wild with what would happen to them. And that one of the guys even considered taking his own life quickly so that he wouldn't experience being torn apart by the wolves. But then, one day when the sun came up, they finally were able to see the wolves. And to their surprise, what they had imagined was a pack of like 20 wolves. In reality, it was only 2. With that clarity, their fears faded away again. They were able to calm down quite a bit, and their morale was rising again, making them feel a lot more capable, a lot more able to confront the situation, and just stronger overall, making them feel again like, okay, we got this. And something very similar happens to you when you have a lot of clarity about the urge. It may feel like you must scratch that itch, and if you don't, something really dooming is going to happen, like the world is going to end. You're feeling trapped and forced. But when you learn to simply study and observe the urge with a calm mind, you can suddenly realize that any urge, no matter how strong it is simply a set of inner thoughts, inner pictures, and emotions and sensations. And that's it. So you go from having to deal with this overpowering sense of I must do this to a set of distinct thoughts, pictures, emotions and sensations. The urge, whatever that is, suddenly becomes a lot easier to grasp. Similar to Musashi or the two travelers, who after they really see what's going on, they are now much more capable of handling the situation. Your mind is much more organized now, and that in and of itself already helps you calm down the nervous system. And by now we know that an amped up nervous system is something that your body wants to calm down again with something like the Adada patterns. And the more you study the PMO urges, or any urge for that matter, the more you will realize that emotions, handling the emotions, is your strongest weapon against them. It's not the thoughts, which we usually use. We try to like reason our way out of the urge, or try to convince ourselves to not do it, to hang on, to plea with ourselves, to hype ourselves up. But that's not where your most powerful weapons are. Emotions are way better at influencing our thoughts than thoughts are at influencing our emotions. It is a two-way street, no question about it. But one side is way stronger than the other. And you probably have noticed yourself that the more intense the urge is, the less effective self-talk becomes. Because it's the emotion behind the urge that is overpowering you, not the thought. Because it's the emotion behind the thought that makes it so enticing, that is so overpowering. It's not the thought itself. It's the emotion underneath the thought. So if you want to become a master of any urge, you first have to become a master of your own emotions. And by studying urges and gaining clarity on what is really going on, what processes, tiny processes are going on all the time, you can actively train your brain and your mind to let go of some thoughts and emotions, conjure up others, refocus. You can start moving, you can start directing, and you stay in the driver's seat. But training this takes time, just like anything, just like sword fighting. And you don't have to jump straight into training with intense urges. You can start with like minor discomfort, for example. Study your urge to eat junk food, to play video games, to look at your phone. Look at the resistance to doing the right thing. You know you should be going to the gym, you know you should be reading this, you know you should be studying, but you're not really doing it. What is your mind doing? What thoughts are coming up? What images? What emotions? A good place to start is to just be with the discomfort. Really look at what is really going on. For example, one of the first discomforts that I really trained with, that I really got curious about, was mosquito bites. Meaning that I literally had to like not scratch that itch and just observe what was going on in that area and just be with it, be with that discomfort. And the more you study this and more clarity you gain, the more powerful you become in just being with it and dissolving it and managing it. And the more you train your mind, the more you study urges, the faster you're rewiring your brain to react differently to certain thoughts, to certain emotions, to certain sensations. And while you stay in the driver's seat, you can actively teach your brain and your mind to move into specific directions instead of being dragged along in zombie mode, only realizing what happens after you relapsed. So overcoming addiction is very complex. There are a lot of moving parts to it. And if you want to know about all the other aspects that are important, if you really want to break free and overcome the addiction, then check out my other video in which I give you a broader overview of all the important aspects.